Thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar on air permit basics. I'm Tom Petersen, and I'm the President of Environmental and Engineering Solutions, and I'm going to be your first presenter today. Mark Huncik will do the second half of the presentation, and we look forward to hearing him as well. So we're going to present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be happy to have a question and answer session. So feel free during the webinar to post any questions that you might have in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can post questions. We'll be happy to get to them at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to all of them, we will definitely get to them in writing and send that to you. We're also planning on sending a copy of all these slides, so you don't have to feel like you need to take notes. We will be sending the slides out today. So my company, Environmental and Engineering Solutions, is a full-service environmental, health, and safety consulting and engineering firm. We're located in southeastern Pennsylvania. We're very close to Philadelphia. Now, please check our website for the other webinar that we've already got posted. We did on pharmaceutical waste management a few months ago. And we also have a pretty extensive library of blog posts and articles on the website, along with the normal information about our company. We will be posting a recording of this webinar on the website within a few days. So our contact info is here on the screen, and we'll also have the contact info at the end of the webinar. And as I mentioned, we'll be sending you the slides. We do plan on hosting webinars about twice a year. So if you have any topics that you might like us to cover in future webinars, definitely let us know. So I started my company back in 1996. And we've been going strong for about 25 years now. We provide consulting and engineering services to a pretty wide range of clients. You can see that we provide quite a bit of service to the healthcare industry, to the manufacturing industry, such as chemicals, surface coating, metal finishing, pretty wide variety of manufacturing operations that we provide services for. We provide a good bit of service for the recycling industry, and for that I'm speaking about things like electronics recycling and automotive parts recycling, helping this wide range of clients with a number of different types of services. We also provide services for universities, higher education. So what type of services do we provide? Well, we specialize in air quality consulting. We also provide quite a bit of environmental consulting, such as water and wastewater design, stormwater permitting. We provide health and safety consulting, so we can come in and do personal exposure monitoring for your employees. We can prepare health and safety manuals and all things OSHA related. We do also design ventilation systems, so we can come in and design a hooding and ductwork exhaust system in a manufacturing environment. And we provide sustainability consulting. We're about to start a project doing a sustainability assessment for a healthcare system in Pennsylvania. Now, focusing a little bit on our air quality capabilities. So we are pretty much soup to nuts in terms of anything you would need for air permitting. So we can help upfront estimating the air emissions for criteria and hazardous air pollutants. Criteria pollutants are things like carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen, particulate, and then hazardous air pollutants is a long list of about 189 pollutants. We can do a best available control technology review. You may need to do this for your permit applications to determine whether, let's say you're going to put in a dust collector whether that meets the criteria for best available control technology. We can help you try to reduce your air emissions either during your operations or even prior when you're thinking about putting in a new process or a new boiler. We can help you with emission reduction strategies. We conduct air dispersion modeling, which Mark Huncik will get to in a little bit later. We do stack testing. Sometimes stack testing is a requirement of the air permit. We can help with air pollution control systems, selection and design. So if you do need a dust collector or an afterburner or a scrubber, we can help with that. And we can help with regulatory agency liaison. So we can act as the liaison between you and the regulatory agency to help ensure that the permitting process goes smoothly. And we frequently will help conduct a pre-application meeting with the regulatory agency. We do this work nationwide, and but we certainly have a majority of our clients in about a 100-mile radius from the Philadelphia area. We're going to talk a little bit about some of this Pennsylvania and the surrounding states a little bit later in the webinar. The last thing on the list here is ongoing assistance once you get your permit. Once you get your pre-construction permit or your operating permit, we can help you to make sure that you're in compliance with that permit. All right, so now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation. So why are we talking about air permitting? Well, it dates back to 1970 and actually before that. But in 1970, under the presidency of Richard Nixon, the Clean Air Act was put into law, federal law. And that Clean Air Act in 1970 then results in regulations. And we're going to talk about some of the regulations and get into more detail. But I wanted to set the stage by letting you know that it dates back to 1970. And how was the federal government able to pass clean air legislation or laws? It relates to the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. So Congress has the power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So that's in the Constitution. So what we're talking about here is mainly the phrase among the several states, because the Clean Air Act and other environmental laws do go over state lines. So what somebody does in Pennsylvania is going to affect New Jersey, et cetera, in terms of air emissions. So Congress has the right to regulate among the several states because of that Commerce Clause. And every major post-1970 environmental law relies on this constitutional power, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, to restrict air and water pollution and to protect endangered species. So that's 1970. Now, fast forward about 7 years to 1977. The Clean Air Act was amended in 1977, a pretty substantial amendment to the Clean Air Act. And what that did was that added in new source review permitting for facilities. So what is it? A facility would be a stationary facility, such as a hospital, manufacturing facility. So the new source review permitting within the 77 amendments really ramped up the idea that prior to putting in new equipment, you have to determine what your requirements are under the Clean Air Act, and you may need to get a permit. The new source review permitting applies nationwide. There's a pretty big distinction as to whether you're in an attainment area or a non-attainment area. So urban environments like, let's say, Philadelphia or Los Angeles, a lot of times they would be non-attainment for certain pollutants, meaning that they have a ways to go in terms of cleaning up the air in that urban environment. So the new source review permitting is different depending on whether your facility is in a non-attainment or an attainment area. And then also you have to decide whether you're going to be a major source or a minor source. A lot of our clients do end up being minor sources, but we provide major source and minor source permitting. A lot of times we're able to provide recommendations that allow our clients to fall into the category of a minor source, and that will help to streamline the air permitting. All right, so that was 1977. In 1990, the Clean Air Act was amended again under George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr. And these, the titles of that 1990 Clean Air Act amendment are listed on the screen here. So we had Title I, which is National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That provides ambient standards for the criteria pollutants, again, such as carbon monoxide, ground level ozone. So that Title I of the Clean Air Act affects what levels are considered safe in the ambient air. Title II of the 1990 amendments affects mobile sources. So that has to do with your cars and trucks, your fuel standards, standards affecting catalytic converters, affecting gas stations in terms of fuel dispensing. It affects whether or not there's ethanol in the gasoline. So that Title II affects mobile sources. Title III is specifically for toxics. So that's a list of 189 hazardous air pollutants that are regulated under this 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. Those hazardous air pollutants are then regulated industry by industry. So this is a pretty broad part of the Clean Air Act, affecting a wide range of industries throughout the country as to their emissions of hazardous air pollutants or toxics. Title IV is acid rain or acid deposition. So there was a pretty substantial problem with acid rain in the lakes and streams. And this title of the Clean Air Act was very helpful in reducing acid precipitation and cleaning up the lakes and streams throughout the country. Title V, we're going to talk about a lot more. That's for permitting. Title VI is ozone, and this is your ozone layer. So this is the stratospheric ozone. So this title impacted the regulation of Freon and other types of chemicals used in air conditioning and used in aerosol sprays, for example. So this title impacted those chemicals and tried to reduce the emissions of chemicals that would be detrimental to the ozone layer. Title VII is the last one, and that's enforcement. We're not going to talk about that in this webinar, but essentially this did ramp up the level of enforcement at the federal level. So, you know, there is substantial enforcement power that EPA has, and that does trickle down to the states. Now, since 1990, there really has not been a major change in the Clean Air Act. So that's about 31 years ago. So the Federal Clean Air Act really hasn't been amended significantly since then. Now this slide, I'm going to walk through at a pretty high level what it takes to apply for an air permit and what different types of permits you might think about getting or needing for your facility. So if you're planning on, let's say, putting in a new boiler or a new emergency generator or a new process line of some sort, that should immediately trigger in your head, along with all the other aspects of putting in new equipment, you know, do I need an air permit for that new equipment? So the first thing I would recommend is that you take a look at your state or potentially your city website pertaining to permitting. So Philadelphia does have its own set of air permit regulations. So if you're within the boundaries of Philadelphia or New York City, you would have to look at the city regulations. But outside of urban environments, and Pittsburgh is another one that has its own air permit regulations at the city level. Outside of that, you would look at your state environmental regulatory agency website, and then you would go over to the air permitting section of that website. Then you would decide, the next step would be, you would say, well, maybe I don't even need a permit at all. If your equipment is going to be very small or have insignificant emissions to the air, you may not need a permit. So you might consider submitting, like in Pennsylvania, it's called a request for determination. And other states have very similar procedures where it's usually a one-page application, you submit it, and they can tell you, no, you wouldn't need a permit in that case. So that would be in the next step. And even for that, you may consider getting some help to prepare the request for determination. Then you have to think about, well, is this the first piece of equipment at a new facility, or do I already have an operating permit for my facility? And am I adding a piece of equipment to a facility that's already got other process equipment and may have, or may already have, a facility-wide operating permit? So you're wanting to distinguish between the permit you need prior to construction or pre-construction for the individual piece of equipment, and you're distinguishing that from what you might need for your entire facility. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit here. So you want to look at pre-construction or operating permit. Then you want to look at how large your facility is. Do you need a Title V operating permit? That would be for a major source. Or might you be able to fit within the category of a synthetic minor or even a natural minor permit? Then you've got to organize your process information, and you have to do emission estimates as part of the process of applying for the permit. You might then consider having a pre-application meeting with the regulators. And that's useful to determine the level of effort in the permit application. Then you would submit, or prepare and submit, your permit application. In Pennsylvania, you might be talking about a plan approval application, which is what Pennsylvania calls a pre-construction permit. And just to let you know, many states have general permits that are available for relatively common emission sources, such as boilers and emergency generators. So you may not have to do a full-blown permit application. There may already be a general permit that you can tag onto that, or say, I'm going to comply with the general permit that's already written up in my state. New Jersey, for example, is good about these. They have general permits already written up for boilers of certain sizes. So you might be able to say, I'm going to fall into that category of a general permit for my new source. Getting back to the bullet list here. So you've prepared and submitted your application. Then the agency will have a draft permit within a certain period of time. It may take them 2 months, 3 months, sometimes even up to 4 or 5 months to actually prepare the application or the permit. And they would send you a draft of the permit. You would then usually have 30 days to comment on the draft of the permit. And at that point, you would provide your comments to the agency, and then they would issue the permit to you. And you don't want to install your equipment prior to getting the permit. So you really have to plan this stuff way in advance, several months in advance, to make sure that you have obtained your permit prior to the installation of the equipment. Then you look at the permit, and if it's a pre-construction permit, you may have certain requirements such as stack testing. So when they issue the final permit, you may still have to do a stack test in order to meet the requirements of that pre-construction permit. Once you've then met the requirements of the pre-construction permit, it's only at that point that you could roll that permit into an ongoing operating permit for the facility. So that's quite a few steps, and that's what it takes to apply for a permit. So let me move along. So now I'm going to give you a brief case study. This is a client of ours that we've been working for about 5 years now. They're a metal recovery and refining facility in Pennsylvania. So they reached out to us and they had some issues with their operating permit where the Pennsylvania DEP was about to fine them, and there were some significant issues. So we conducted a pre-application meeting with Pennsylvania DEP prior to submitting a pre-construction permit for them. So along with the difficulty they were already in with the DEP, they had wanted to put in some new equipment. So we were able to have an organized, well-attended pre-application face-to-face with DEP. We then submitted the plan approval application for a new sweat furnace and new melting pots. There was back and forth with the agency, and then there was a requirement for air dispersion modeling for lead emissions. So we conducted the dispersion modeling for the client. We were able to satisfy those requirements. And then the DEP did issue the permit. Since then, we have been able to submit the annual air emission report to the regulatory agency for this client. We've recently helped them renew their operating permit, so that's a 5-year renewal. We were able to help them get that renewed. And then we're currently arranging for stack testing because there was stack testing required for this new sweat furnace and melting pots. So that was a requirement within the plan approval. So we're doing, a full range of air permitting services for this client. Okay, so I wanted to now introduce your next speaker. His name is Mark Huncik. He's going to share a bit about dispersion modeling and some upcoming and recent changes in air regulations in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Mark is a meteorologist and an air quality consultant with over 30 years experience, and he has been with EES for about 2 years now. Mark, take it away.
Great, thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. If you're on the East Coast, good morning if you're a little farther west. What I will cover today, you've heard Tom talk a little bit about dispersion modeling as an aspect in some permitting actions. And so I wanted to just give kind of a high-level overview of what dispersion modeling is, where it might be triggered or how it may be triggered, and then also where to point you for further information if you so choose or so need to gain that information from the EPA website. So dispersion modeling simply is a computer program or a computer-based program that uses mathematical equations to characterize dispersion in the atmosphere. And the inputs to the dispersion model include your emission source parameters, whether that be the stack height, the exhaust temperature, exhaust flow rate, the emission rate, of course, is very critical as well. But also the model incorporates meteorology into the analysis so that once the air pollutant is released, the meteorology has a large influence on how it is dispersed downwind and what those concentrations may be off-site. The models also incorporate the terrain or the local land use as well to account for what is called simple and complex terrain. Simple terrain being terrain that's surrounding the facility that's generally less than stack height. Complex terrain or higher terrain elevations that are generally above stack top, where the plume could potentially have an impact directly on the terrain. So that's really what the dispersion model does. A lot goes into preparing the model and analyzing and interpreting the results. but that's essentially what the dispersion modeling system does. The current regulatory approved dispersion model is called AERMOD, AERMOD. That's the most widely used dispersion model, and it is the regulatory EPA approved model at this time. That model came into existence in the early 2000s and has gone through at least 15 revisions since then. So a lot of development on the modeling side. But as far as what triggers modeling in a permitting activity, it really depends on the emissions amount and which pollutants are being released. In many cases, smaller facilities will not trigger dispersion modeling just because they have minimal emissions. But as you go to larger facilities or larger emission sources, there could be a concern for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and some modeling may be triggered for that. I think Tom provided the example where we did some modeling for lead, which is a criteria pollutant, and there is a National Ambient Air Quality Standard for lead. There are also analyses that are done on what's called air toxics. You may also hear them called hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs. That's generally the kind of the federal term, HAPs, and states use the term air toxics. But many states have kind of risk-based standards, ambient standards for certain chemicals. And if you release that chemical in sufficient quantities, you may trigger an analysis in that particular state. When you're dealing with much larger facilities, you may trigger the New Source Review or NSR regulations. Also, what a regulation under NSR called PSD, or Prevention of Significant Deterioration. And those are much higher level analyses where you're looking at what the impact is of that project or that source, if it's a new source, on the ambient environment surrounding that facility. So you'll be looking at whether it causes a significant impact against levels called significant impact levels. Those are specific targets of concentration off-site. You may also trigger the need to model for the overall NAAQS and a subset of that NAAQS called the increment, which is a portion of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. Under the PSD rules, EPA said you must satisfy both the increment and the NAAQS to have a approvable PSD application. One of the other aspects where dispersion modeling has come in many cases, and this includes facilities that don't trigger maybe an air toxics analysis or an NSR analysis, or even an NAAQS analysis, is a good engineering practice or GEP analysis, where you may want to look at what is a sufficient height for your stack or release point or vent, especially if it is near a building or buildings. And the analysis will assess whether or not the plume is unduly impacted by that building. So you can do an analysis to find out what is the best location, if you have some flexibility there, as well as height of your stacks. And we've done that in many facilities, including smaller facilities such as healthcare facilities and other educational facilities that have lab hoods and vents associated with their activities. The overarching guidance that dictates how to perform dispersion modeling for regulatory purposes is contained in the Guideline on Air Quality Models, which is published under 40 CFR Part 51, Appendix W. That appendix, again, came about, I think, in the right after the time of the PSD regulations, so sometime, I believe, in the late 70s, maybe around 1978, the initial Appendix W came around. It has also gone through many revisions over the years, as you might imagine, as the models have changed and the models have been revised, and the recommended and the regulatory models have been promulgated. So that is the go-to guideline for regulatory analyses. It includes a list of recommended models, both screening models and refined models. Screening model is usually kind of a first cut model that gives you an idea of where you stand in relation to the analysis you're performing. Has a lot of assumptions, which can overestimate concentrations, but if you're good to go in that analysis, then you can stop There's no need to quote unquote refine the analysis to try and bring those concentrations down. AirMod is considered a refined model or a refined modeling system, but it also has a screening version called AirScreen. So to find out more about AirMod and AirScreen and other models, you can go to the Support Center for Regulatory Atmospheric Modeling, which is an EPA-run website at the website listed below, www.epa.gov/SCRAM. You'll see a lot of information there, including the models as well as the model user guides and guidelines. And I did skip over the state modeling guidelines. Even though there are federal guidelines, many of those guidelines are not necessarily specific to each state. In many cases, each state have put out their own modeling guidelines because they have programs such as their state air toxics programs that go a little bit above and beyond the standard regulatory modeling analyses that EPA kind of oversees or provides guidance on. So that gives you an idea of some of the background of the modeling, and be more than happy to answer specific questions if you have on modeling. What I'd like to do now is just transition to some updates that or activities we've seen in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware that may affect your permitting efforts in those states going forward. Now, I will tell you that each state follows a similar process that Tom outlined in terms of how you determine if you need an air permit and how you go about applying for those permits. The forms may be different in each state and generally are, but the overall process is the same. But I don't want to go into all those details, but I do want to provide you with some updates for each of these states. So for Pennsylvania, some of the activity, there's been a lot of activity actually in Pennsylvania in the last 2 years, even during these times of the pandemic. Pennsylvania DP has been good in leading a lot of work during this time, even though they've been working mostly remote. One of the more significant changes in Pennsylvania recently was they changed their fee structure. Starting in 2021, fees increased both for applications and the annual maintenance fees, which is kind of an annual operating permit fee. Most states have both fees for application submittals as well as annual fees when you hold an operating permit. In this case here, the fees did go up rather substantially, in some cases from $375 to $2,500, and in some cases near $4,000. So a much larger increase in just fees associated with permitting. Pennsylvania has also looked at implementing some electronic fee payment options, and they have implemented those. As you can imagine, electronic submittals and electronic fee payments are kind of even more important nowadays than they ever have been, since many staff are not in their offices. So there are some options to handle things electronically. Speaking of electronically in Pennsylvania, Greenport has been kind of the go-to online submittal platform that Pennsylvania DEP has used over the years. They did make some changes to that this past year and require you to create a new account for that new system. But if you had an existing account on Greenport, it would just be a matter of linking that old account, and all your existing information is transferred automatically over. And if you don't have a Greenport account, it's fairly straightforward in terms of signing up for one. And so if you're interested in that, just do a search for Greenport on the Pennsylvania DEP website. Pennsylvania over the years, especially with the oil and gas industry, has been going through many revisions within their permit exemptions. As Tom mentioned, one of the first things you need to determine when you have a new process or a new source or are making a modification at your facility or installing a new facility is whether or not there is a permit exemption that applies. In many cases, if it's a smaller emitting source, there could be an exemption that wouldn't require a permit or even a permit submittal in the end. Those exemptions have gone through revision, and I think there is a current draft under review right now for permit exemptions, especially for some of the oil and gas activities. What you'll be seeing here in Pennsylvania, as well as in other states, is a lot of attention on environmental justice and environmental justice reviews as part of a permitting effort. Those reviews are to address populations that may be adversely impacted by an activity because they have a history of being in a pollution dense area, and there is a big push to make sure that their rights for clean air are protected. So if if your source or facility triggers an environmental justice review as part of permitting, just expect there to be a little more analysis of the offsite effect of your emissions, as well as an increased public participation effort during the process. And what that will do ultimately is slow down the permitting process. That's one of the biggest impacts, but if you are aware of it up front, you can account for it by starting that process early or learning what environmental justice areas are near your facility. Pennsylvania DEP is also going through some revisions in their oil and gas Chapter 129 regulations. They just recently proposed a RACT 3, or reasonably available control technology regulation for nitrogen oxides and VOCs. These are directly related to ozone air quality and ozone non-attainment issues. Pennsylvania is in the ozone transport region as well, but there are some specific non-attainment issues in certain parts of the state, especially the southeastern part of the state where Philadelphia is. One of the more recent changes also is that annual emission statements are required for synthetic miners. Those hadn't been required previously unless the permit specifically required or had a condition that required that submittal. But starting in 2021, for the 2020 calendar year, synthetic miners had to submit an AES. And that can be done through the AES online portal, which is part of Greenport, which I mentioned earlier. Also, Pennsylvania has also put a little more emphasis on the land use policy, and this goes back to where your facility is located, what the existing zoning is for at the facility and the nearby properties, and how your activity conforms to that land use. So knowing your zoning or making early contact with your local zoning office is important, because in many parts of Pennsylvania, there are comprehensive zoning plans that cover multi-county or multi-jurisdictional locations. So important to know that you are in conformance with those zoning requirements. Next, we'll jump over to New Jersey. Some updates here. Again, there were have been some changes in some of the regulations. One of them was during the pandemic. They created some extensions for monitoring and emissions reports, so they relaxed the deadlines for some of that activity, but that ended in March of this year. So that now everybody has to comply with whatever deadlines are located within your current permit. New Jersey is also looking at EJ reviews. They actually passed a bill in August of 2020 to give special attention to EJ reviews. So again, it would be good to make sure that wherever you're located within New Jersey, whether or not your facility will be a target for an EJ review, and build that into your planning process. New Jersey also created or provided a new risk screening worksheet. As I mentioned earlier, air toxics, such as, let me give you an example, like formaldehyde, benzene, and other pollutants like that. If you release those, you may trigger some type of review of offsite impact or risk associated with those emissions, and there's a new worksheet that they provided in New Jersey for that. They've also increased their emissions fees. Seems to be par for the course across many states. They are increasing fees for applications and for operating permits. In this case, the emissions fee is $129.59 per ton of regulated pollutant. As I think Tom mentioned earlier, New Jersey does have general permits, so does Pennsylvania and many other states. But there was a new general permit issued in early 2020 for smaller boilers between 10 and 50 million BTUs per hour. That general permit, or those boilers that are affected by that general permit, would also be affected by a new source performance standard, and the general permit incorporates those requirements. There's also a lot of activity when it comes to emergency generators, as well as generators for non-emergency purposes. But in late 2019, they did issue a new general permit for emergency generators that burn diesel fuel, generally, or distillate fuels. And New Jersey has also provided some indication that they may be going back and updating their SOTA guidance, or state-of-the-art guidance. And that document is directly related to control technologies, much like a BACT or BACT analysis. They provide, the SOTA document provides kind of presumptive BACT or presumptive controls for certain sources, and they would look for new facilities or modifications to follow that guidance. Now moving on to Delaware, some changes there as well. Again, they have an environmental justice focus as well, and they've had some panel discussions back in 2019, and there are more coming, I believe, this summer for that. They've increased their fees for certain permits, much like other states. They are going through some revisions in their VOC rules for solvent cleaning and drying, as well as stage 1 and stage 2 gas dispensing. So if you have any of those activities, that will affect your permits potentially. They also made some changes in their registration process for smaller sources, where they've provided a registration form and a screening model spreadsheet, and other requirements for smaller sources, so that you go through a registration process rather than a formal permitting process. They are also looking at greenhouse gases, which other states are doing as well. In this case here, they're focusing on HFCs, and they're trying to phase down the use of HFCs. And I think if you followed the news recently, even the Biden administration is making or creating a large focus on HFCs as well. There was an announcement earlier this year that they'll be looking into that. So, so that's some updates that may affect some permitting for certain sources, or for minor sources and even major sources in these states. What I'd like to do next is just to provide a short case study. This was in Delaware, where we did some permitting for a technology center where they were installing some emergency generators. So these were strictly emergency use generators. It does get a little more complex if they want to install generators and also operate them for demand response or peaking operations. I've done quite a bit of permitting in that realm as well, but in this case here, they were strictly for emergency backup use at this location. And they had a fairly tight construction schedule, as you can imagine. When we were contacted, they were down the road already in terms of overall construction. The units hadn't been brought on site yet, but they were close to being brought on site, and they hadn't addressed the air permitting yet. So so one of the keys is we reached out to the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, their Division of Air Quality, made early communication with them once we found out what was needed for this particular project, and worked with them very closely to make sure that we followed their requirements. They actually have an initial notification form for these types of installations, which is kind of a precept to the application submittal. They also have some storage tank registration requirements, because these were diesel generators, and the air division here handled some of the tank registration requirements, even though there are in many states different divisions, like the Division of Water Quality in many states handle storage tank registrations. In this case here, we had to address that also through the air permitting. And we prepared the applications and mailed and emailed those out. As you can imagine, the email or any electronic submittal is important nowadays, and many offices will accept applications by email, followed up by official signatures in the mail. And less than 2 months later, or a month and a half later, we were able to get that permit and keep the project on time. And I think that that ends my part of the presentation. I'll stay online here in case that we have any questions. Go ahead, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. Really appreciate that. So just had a little quote here from Martin Luther King III. This is from about 6 years ago. He says, because no matter who we are or where we come from, we're all entitled to the basic human rights of clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and healthy land to call home. So your work to apply for and comply with your air permits does help ensure this right for your employees and also the neighbors of your facility. So we wanted to now have a Q&A session. I'm going to check, see what questions we have. All right, so we do have a question here. Our facility has an air permit. How far in advance do we need to start the renewal process? I guess I'll take that one. If your facility has an air permit, I guess you're talking about an operating permit. So this is a facility-wide operating permit. Let's say you have a few boilers, you have some process equipment. Your operating permit is typically good for a 5-year period. Now, that has to be renewed every 5 years. So what you really need to do is start the application process for the renewal. My recommendation is typically 8 months ahead of time. Usually, you're supposed to have a complete application in before the agency that's what they consider complete. Usually, you have to do that no later than 6 months before your permit expires. So the reason I'm saying 8 months is that you want to submit the renewal application, and then if there's any issue or problem with the application, the agency can turn around and give you comments, and then you can revise the application, and you'll still have time to submit that revised application at least 6 months ahead of time. So that's for your annual operating permit renewal. And again, that's typically every 5 years. So hopefully that answered that question. Let me see, I'm checking.
Tom, let me just add real quick. Different states do have could have different submittal deadlines as well. So it's always good to double check the state requirements. Some require 6 months. I've seen 9 months prior to expiration for the due date, but definitely want to start the process early to make sure you have everything accounted for, because there could have been some changes in regulatory requirements prior to the renewal, and being aware of those would be important to make sure you cover in the renewal application.
Yep, absolutely, I agree. All right, let's see. This next question I would say is for Mark. Mark, could you explain the difference between estimating emissions and conducting dispersion modeling? So that's just kind of a basic level.
Yeah, sure. Two different things. The estimation of emissions is really using whether it be standardized emission factors, which can be available from both EPA and their AP42 compilation of emission factors. Some states have their own guidance and factors for different types of equipment. Most are based on a pounds of emissions per process rate, whether that be firing rate for a boiler, and so forth. So the emissions estimating is one part of, and is a critical part for any air permit application. Many times you can rely upon manufacturer or vendor information, guarantees of emissions, as well as guarantees of emissions control or control efficiency, or capture and control efficiency, or destruction efficiency. You can take those all into account in estimating your emissions. When it comes to dispersion modeling, that would be, if it is required, is the kind of the next step of taking those emissions and seeing how those emissions affect downwind concentrations. So the modeling would help you to estimate what happens to those emissions once they're released from the emission source, and what the impact or concentration would be downwind or off-site or at specific locations that are designated in the modeling analysis.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, Mark. Thanks a lot. I had a third question here. We're in the process of constructing a new facility, and I know we will need an air permit. When should we start the process of applying for an air permit? Mark, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Geez, I would recommend as early as possible. You know, it somewhat depends on the complexity of the facility, what your air emissions would be, and to even know whether you qualify for a permit exemption or what type of permit you may be applying for, you really need to have a handle on the type of equipment and what those emissions are. And that takes some work up front as well. So as early on in the process as possible. But I have been doing this for many years, and no matter how many times we say as early as possible, there is always the case where, because of one reason or another, it isn't addressed, and it turns into a scramble to try to keep the project viable while you're addressing air quality permitting requirements. And no one likes to hold up a project. But as early as possible, it would be good to engage your environmental health and safety staff, any corporate environmental staff you have, as well as potentially reaching out to some off-site support from consultants or contractors.
Great, sounds good. All right, looks like we have one more question. I bought a company with emission units that have air permits. Can the permit be transferred to my company's name? How do I apply for an air permit? That's sort of several questions at once. Basically, if you bought a company, what I would suggest is that you get in touch with the regulatory agency, let them know that you've had a transfer in ownership, and get the air permit. Essentially, it would be an operating permit for the facility. Get that permit to be modified so that it accurately reflects, you know, the owner of the company, and also what would be considered the responsible official. And typically, you'd have a responsible official listed in the permit, and then perhaps the day-to-day environmental manager at the facility. So I would definitely recommend updating your permit and not waiting until the renewal period, which might be a year or two, you know, from then. So I would update that information when you have a transfer of ownership. Let me check. All right, looks like that's all the questions. Now, if anybody does have any questions that you think of later, please feel free to email either Mark or I. We do have our contact information on the screen here, and the website. Our phone numbers are listed and our email addresses. And we look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in the field at your facilities. And also, as I mentioned, we will be doing these webinars a couple of times a year. So I want to thank everybody, and we will be sending out the slides very soon. And we appreciate your attendance, and have a great day. And thanks very much, Mark. And we'll see you all later. Take care.
Have a great afternoon.